A black nurse was on her way home after a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. Exhausted but proud of the lives she had saved that day, as she stopped at a local coffee shop to grab a quick pick-me-up. A confrontation with a racist customer turned her world upside down. What started as a simple misunderstanding spiraled into public humiliation, leaving her shaken and questioning her worth. But just 10 minutes later, a stranger's bold act of solidarity changed everything, setting off a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. Stay with me, this is a story you don't want to miss. Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from today. And if this story inspires you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. The morning light spilled through the large bay windows of Sylvie's bake shop, casting soft golden hues over its polished wooden tables. This corner of Westwood had its charms: old brick facades, tree-lined streets, and a rhythm that hummed with both the promise and contradictions of city life. Inside the cafe, the smell of fresh scones and strong coffee wrapped itself around the patrons like an embrace. It was, on the surface, a sanctuary. Camille Scott, the young cashier with a ready smile and steady hands, moved with practiced ease behind the counter. She knew nearly every customer by name or, at least, by their order. The retired teacher who liked his bagels barely toasted. The couple who shared a newspaper and a blueberry muffin. The young mother balancing a toddler and a chai latte. Each one greeted her warmly. And Camille greeted them back, her voice carrying a melody that seemed to soften the sharp edges of the day. Yet, even in a place like Sylvie's, where warmth and familiarity were baked into the walls, there was an undercurrent of tension Camille had learned to navigate. It wasn't the kind of tension people spoke of openly. It was subtler, quieter. It lingered in the hesitations, in the averted gazes, in the unspoken hierarchies that ordered the world outside and, occasionally, seeped in. That morning, the first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a small frown, a microaggression disguised as a fleeting expression. "Morning, Mr. Bishop," Camille said as she handed a regular his coffee. He nodded stiffly, taking the cup without meeting her eyes. His voice was barely above a mutter. "You didn't forget the cream this time, did you?" Camille's smile didn't falter, though something in her chest tightened. "No, sir," she replied, "just the way you like it." She watched him walk away, his shoulders squared with a dignity she often felt was denied to her. It wasn't the first time Mr. Bishop had made her feel invisible. And it wouldn't be the last. The next moment came with a sharper edge. A young man in a suit approached the counter, glancing at Camille before speaking. "I'll take a latte," he said, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. Camille rang up his order and reached for the change. But before she could hand it to him, he held up a hand. "Keep it," he said, his tone dismissive. "Thank you," Camille said, forcing a polite smile. "Just make sure it's quick," he added, his eyes flicking to the line behind him. The words stung more than they should have. Not for their rudeness but for the way they stripped her of humanity. To him, she was nothing more than a machine, a nameless hand on the other side of the counter. By mid-morning, the cafe had settled into its usual rhythm. Camille was wiping down the counter when she noticed a group of women sitting by the window. They were well dressed, their voices low but animated. Camille wasn't close enough to hear their words, but their occasional glances in her direction told her enough. It wasn't the first time she'd been the subject of whispered conversations. It happened often, in spaces like this, where the veneer of civility was as thin as the porcelain cups they drank from. Camille forced herself to focus on her work. She knew better than to dwell on what couldn't be changed. The real test of the day came just after noon. The lunch rush was in full swing when a woman in an expensive coat approached the counter. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, and her expression was carefully neutral until her eyes landed on Camille. For a moment, the woman didn't speak. She simply stared, her gaze scanning Camille from head to toe. "Good afternoon," Camille said, her voice steady. "How can I help you?" The woman's lips tightened. "I'd prefer someone else to take my order," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the cafe like a blade. Camille blinked, the words hanging in the air between them. She opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, the woman continued. "It's nothing personal," she added, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I just think, well, someone else might be more appropriate." The line behind the woman grew still. Conversation stopped. Camille could feel the weight of their stares. Some curious, others sympathetic, and a few entirely indifferent. Her heart pounded, but her voice didn't waver. "I'm the cashier today, ma'am," she said, her words measured. "If you'd like to place an order, I'd be happy to help." The woman's nostrils flared. "I don't think you understand," she said, leaning closer. "I'd rather not have you handling my food." The silence in the cafe deepened. Camille's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. But she didn't flinch. "I assure you," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'm fully capable of doing my job." In that moment, the tension that had been simmering all morning reached its boiling point. The woman straightened, her expression hardening. "Is there a manager I can speak to?" she asked, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Camille didn't have to answer. Kevin, the owner, appeared from the back, his apron dusted with flour. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his tone even. The woman turned to him with a look of relief, as if he were her savior. "I'd like someone else to serve me," she said, "preferably someone more appropriate." Kevin's brow furrowed. "Camille is one of our best employees," he said. "If there's an issue, I'd like to know what you mean by appropriate." The woman hesitated, her confidence faltering under Kevin's steady gaze. But when she spoke again, her voice was sharp with indignation. "I just think it would be better if someone else handled my order," she said. Kevin's expression darkened, but he kept his voice calm. "Let me be clear," he said. "We don't tolerate discrimination here. If you're uncomfortable being served by Camille, I'll have to ask you to leave." The room fell silent. Camille stood still, her hands resting lightly on the counter. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let it show. The woman's face flushed with anger. But she didn't argue. She turned on her heel and stormed out, the bell above the door jingling sharply as it closed behind her. For a moment, the cafe remained quiet. Then, one by one, the customers began to clap. Camille's cheeks flushed, but this time, it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from something deeper, a quiet pride. A recognition that, for once, the weight of the world hadn't been hers to carry alone. The rhythm of the day resumed. But the undercurrent remained, the challenge of navigating a world where such moments were never far away. And yet, Camille knew she'd faced it with grace. For today, at least, that was enough. The morning's confrontation lingered in the air like a shadow no amount of sunlight could dispel. Camille moved through her tasks with practiced efficiency. But beneath her calm exterior was a tide of emotions she refused to let spill. She had weathered storms like this before. The kind that rose not from outright hostility but from the quieter, more insidious kind of judgment that wore the face of civility. Around her, the cafe hummed with life again. Yet, as Camille handed a latte to a regular, her mind replayed the confrontation like a record stuck on a loop. The tension was familiar. Not a loud clash of ideologies but the quiet, everyday battle of being seen not just as competent but as deserving of basic human dignity. The next test came in the form of subtle whispers. A group of women in their 60s sat near the window, their manicured hands cradling porcelain cups of tea. Their voices were low, but Camille caught snippets as she wiped down a nearby table. "It's just not professional, you know," one said, her tone hushed but sharp. Another murmured her agreement. She could have handled that more gracefully. Camille's ears burned, but she didn't look up. She understood what they meant by grace. They wanted her silence, her submission. To them, her calm response had been too assertive, too confident for someone in her position. When Camille returned to the counter, she felt their eyes on her. She straightened her back and met their gazes head on. Her expression neutral. The whispers stopped, replaced by a studied silence. By lunchtime, the cafe was packed. A tall man in a tailored suit entered, his presence commanding attention. He approached the counter with a briefcase in one hand and a phone pressed to his ear. Without acknowledging Camille, he placed the briefcase on the counter and held up a finger, signaling her to wait. She stood patiently as he finished his call, though the growing line behind him bristled with impatience. When he finally looked up, his eyes flicked over her dismissively. "Espresso. Double shot. Make it quick," he said, sliding his credit card toward her. Camille rang up the order, her movements steady, as she handed him the receipt. He glanced at her name tag. "Camille," he said, his tone testing. "You've worked here long?" "Yes, sir," she replied evenly. He didn't respond, instead turning his attention back to his phone. Camille placed his espresso on the counter. But he didn't pick it up until he finished his call. When he finally did, he took a sip, frowned, and placed the cup back down. "This isn't hot enough," he said curtly. "I don't know how you people manage to mess up something this simple." The words were sharp enough to cut through the room's ambient noise. Camille's chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I can make you another," she offered. The man waved a hand. "Don't bother. Just try to do better next time." He walked away, leaving his unfinished cup on the counter. Camille exhaled slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. The afternoon lull brought a temporary reprieve, but Camille knew better than to let her guard down. Around 3 p.m., a mother and her young son entered. The boy's eyes lit up at the sight of the pastry display. But his mother's expression darkened as soon as she spotted Camille behind the counter. "Can someone else help us?" she asked, her voice tinged with a politeness that felt anything but polite. Camille's stomach twisted, but she responded with her usual professionalism. "I'd be happy to help," she said. "What can I get for you?" The mother hesitated, glancing at the line behind her. When no one else stepped forward, she sighed dramatically. "Fine, 2 eclairs and a lemonade." Camille prepared the order quickly, her movements precise. As she handed over the bag, the mother pulled her son closer and whispered something in his ear. Camille couldn't hear the words, but the boy looked back at her with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The interaction was over in less than 2 minutes, but its weight lingered. It wasn't the overt rejection that stung. It was the quiet lesson being passed down, a subtle but potent inheritance of prejudice. By the end of her shift, Camille felt the day's small cuts adding up. Each interaction, on its own, seemed insignificant, just a frown here, a dismissive word there, but together, they formed a pattern as old as the city streets outside. It was the pattern of being othered in spaces she'd worked hard to belong to. As she clocked out, Camille thought of the woman from that morning and the man with the espresso and the mother with her whispered lesson. They weren't villains in the traditional sense. They were polite, professional, even courteous in their own ways. But their actions, small, cumulative, painted a picture of a world that still hadn't learned to see beyond the color of her skin. Outside, the evening air was cool, and the city lights flickered to life. Camille paused on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath. The challenges of the day had not broken her, but they had left their mark. She straightened her shoulders and began walking, her steps steady against the backdrop of the bustling city. Tomorrow would bring more tests, she knew, but for tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet resolve. The morning after the events at Sylvie's bake shop dawned clear and bright. The kind of day that invited optimism. But for Camille Scott, stepping into the cafe felt different. The air inside wasn't oppressive, but it carried a tension she couldn't quite shake. Yesterday's incidents lingered in her mind, not as a sharp pain but as a dull ache. A reminder of the unspoken rules she had to navigate each day. The regulars greeted her as they always did. A few even offered words of encouragement, their voices low as though acknowledging a shared secret. "You handled yourself well yesterday," one older man murmured, his gray eyes kind. Camille thanked him, but the compliment felt like a double-edged sword. Her handling the situation wasn't a triumph, it was survival. And she knew survival would demand more of her before the day was done. The first challenge came quietly. A pair of college-aged women entered the cafe, their laughter cutting through the soft hum of conversation. They were dressed in crisp jackets and expensive boots, their bags bearing designer logos. Camille recognized them from previous visits. They always ordered oat milk lattes, their interactions peppered with clipped words and impatient glances. As Camille prepared their drinks, she overheard one of them whisper, her voice barely audible above the hiss of the espresso machine. "Remember last time? I told you she got my order wrong." The other woman snickered. "Figures," she replied. "I mean, you get what you pay for, right?" Camille's hands stilled for just a moment, the words hanging in the air. She didn't turn toward them, didn't meet their eyes when she handed them their drinks. Instead, she offered the same polite smile she gave every customer. But as they left, their laughter trailing behind them, Camille felt the weight of their judgment settle on her shoulders. They hadn't addressed her directly, hadn't raised their voices, but their disdain had been loud enough to echo. By mid-morning, the cafe was bustling. Camille barely had time to catch her breath between orders, as she rang up a tall man in a construction vest. She noticed a woman lingering near the counter. The woman was in her 40s, dressed in a tailored blazer, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She had an air of authority, the kind that made people instinctively straighten their posture. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice clipped. "Can I speak to the manager?" Camille glanced toward the kitchen, where Kevin was busy with a delivery. "He's not available at the moment," she replied. "Can I help you with something?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "I'd prefer to speak with someone in charge." Camille felt the familiar twist in her stomach, but she held her ground. "I'm happy to assist you, ma'am," she said evenly. The woman hesitated, then leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. I noticed the way you handled the register yesterday. I'm sure you mean well, but some of us expect a certain level of professionalism in a place like this." The words were delivered in a tone so polite it could have been mistaken for concern. But Camille heard the real message beneath them. "You don't belong here." "I appreciate your feedback," Camille replied, her voice steady. "If there's something specific you'd like to address, I can pass it along to the manager." The woman gave a tight-lipped smile, clearly unsatisfied. "No need," she said, straightening. "Just something to keep in mind." As she walked away, Camille exhaled slowly, willing herself not to let the encounter ruin her focus. But the seed of doubt the woman had planted was harder to shake than she wanted to admit. The lunch rush brought its own challenges. A group of businessmen in suits filled a corner table, their voices loud and jovial. Camille noticed one of them glance at her as she approached with their coffee. "Hey, miss," he called out, waving her over. Camille forced a smile as she approached. "Yes, sir?" The man grinned, leaning back in his chair. "You must get pretty good tips working here." "Huh?" The comment was innocent enough on the surface, but something in his tone made Camille's skin crawl. "I do all right," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. Another man at the table chuckled. "Bet it helps when you flash that pretty smile," he said. The table erupted in laughter, and Camille's smile faltered. She turned quickly, walking back to the counter before the conversation could continue. Behind the safety of the register, she let out a slow breath. She was used to being underestimated, dismissed, even ignored, but the casual objectification cut in a different way. It was yet another reminder of how the world saw her not as a person, but as something to be judged, commented on, and diminished. The final test of the day came as the cafe began to wind down. An older white man in a tweed jacket entered, his posture stiff, his expression stern. He ordered a black coffee, his voice brusque but polite. As Camille handed him the cup, his eyes lingered on her, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "You work hard," he said abruptly. Camille blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said cautiously. The man nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "Just remember," he added, his voice low, "no matter how hard you work, there are some people who'll never see you as anything more than this." He gestured vaguely toward the counter. Camille froze, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical force. He wasn't being cruel, not exactly. But his statement, by the time the sun began its slow descent behind the city skyline. Camille felt the day pressing heavily against her shoulders. It was the kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical strain and deeper weariness. Etched into her very being, the morning's quiet slights and lunch hours' loud indignities were not isolated events. They were threads in a larger tapestry, a pattern that had woven itself into the fabric of her life. Sylvie's bakeshop bustled with activity, its warm glow a stark contrast to the world outside. Camille tried to focus on her work, the repetition of pouring coffee and ringing up orders a fragile kind of refuge. But the next test was already approaching, as relentless as the ticking clock on the wall. It began innocently enough. A family of 4 entered the cafe, their laughter and chatter filling the air. The parents looked to be in their late 30s, dressed in casual but expensive clothing. Their 2 children, a boy and a girl, darted toward the pastry display, their faces pressed eagerly against the glass. Camille stepped forward, her practiced smile in place. "Good evening, what can I get for you?" The mother glanced at her briefly before returning her attention to the display. "We'll take 2 of those," she said, pointing to a row of eclairs, "and a hot chocolate for each of the kids." Camille nodded, reaching for the pastries, as she wrapped them carefully. The father spoke, his voice low but distinct. "Make sure the kids' cups are extra clean. We've had bad experiences with places like this before. Camille's hand stilled, her grip tightening on the paper wrapper. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the comment. Instead, she finished the task with deliberate precision, handing over the neatly packaged bag with a calm, "Here you go." The father took the bag without a word, and the family settled at a table near the window. But Camille felt their presence like a weight. Every so often, she caught the parents glancing her way, their expressions unreadable but unmistakably critical. The children, oblivious to the undercurrent, sipped their hot chocolate happily, their laughter a bittersweet counterpoint to the unspoken tension. Not long after, a man in his 60s entered the cafe, his gait slow but steady. He wore a wool coat and carried a newspaper under one arm. Camille recognized him immediately, Mr. Fletcher, a longtime regular. He approached the counter with a smile, his lined face warm and familiar. "Evening, Camille," he said. "The usual, please." Camille's smile softened. "Of course, Mr. Fletcher. One black coffee coming right up." As she prepared his order, the door jingled again, admitting a young couple in their 20s. They were well dressed, their matching leather jackets a silent testament to their affluence. They approached the counter, their expressions neutral but expectant. Camille handed Mr. Fletcher his coffee, her hands steady despite the growing line. "Here you go. Enjoy." The man from the couple stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Excuse me, we were here first." Camille blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't realize." The man cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Forget it. Just make sure you don't skip us next time." His companion, a woman with a sleek ponytail, sighed dramatically. "Honestly, you'd think customer service would be better in a place like this." Camille's cheeks burned, but she didn't respond. She took their order, a latte and a cappuccino, and moved to the espresso machine. Her movements mechanical. Behind her, Mr. Fletcher lingered near the counter, his coffee untouched. "Now, hold on a minute," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That's no way to talk to her." The young man turned, his expression incredulous. "Excuse me? You heard me," Mr. Fletcher replied, his tone steady. "This young lady works hard, and she doesn't deserve that kind of attitude." The cafe fell silent, all eyes on the exchange. Camille felt her breath catch, torn between gratitude and apprehension. The woman with the ponytail rolled her eyes. "It's not a big deal. We're just saying." "Exactly," Mr. Fletcher interrupted. "It's not a big deal. So why make it one?" The couple exchanged a glance, their bravado faltering. Without another word, they took their drinks and left, the door jingling sharply behind them. Camille turned to Mr. Fletcher, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." He smiled gently. "You don't need to thank me, Camille. Just keep being you." As the evening wore on, the challenges continued, each one testing Camille's patience and resolve. A man complained that his coffee was too strong, his tone laced with condescension. A woman refused to make eye contact, sliding her credit card across the counter as though Camille's touch might taint it. Each interaction was small, almost imperceptible, but together they formed a chorus, a relentless reminder of the barriers Camille faced every day. When the clock finally struck 8, signaling the end of her shift, Camille exhaled a sigh of relief. She wiped down the counter one last time, her movements slow but deliberate. Kevin approached, his expression unreadable. "Tough day?" he asked. Camille nodded, her voice tired but steady. "It's always tough." Kevin placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "You did good today," he said, "better than most of us could." Camille offered a faint smile, but the weight of the day still lingered. As she stepped outside into the crisp evening air, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. The challenges were far from over, but neither was she. In a world that often refused to see her, Camille had learned to see herself, and that, she decided, was enough to keep going. For now, the night brought little rest. Camille tossed and turned in the small apartment she shared with her sister. The hum of the city outside her window, an unrelenting reminder of a world that never quite paused. Her mind replayed the events of the previous day, the cutting remarks, the whispers, the dismissive gestures. They weren't new, but they felt heavier somehow, as though each small indignity carried the weight of all the others she had ever endured. By the time her alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., she was already awake. She dressed quickly, tying her curls into a neat bun and slipping into the simple uniform she had come to associate with both pride and exhaustion. Sylvie's bake shop was quiet when she arrived, the stillness of early morning a welcome contrast to the bustle she knew would follow. Kevin greeted her with a tired but genuine smile as he unloaded a fresh batch of pastries. "Morning, Camille," he said. "Ready for another round?" She smiled back, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Always. The first customer of the day was a middle-aged man in a crisp business suit. He ordered a black coffee and a plain croissant, his tone brisk but polite. Camille handed him his order, her smile automatic. As he turned to leave, he paused, his brow furrowing slightly as he looked at her. "You've been here a while, haven't you?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she replied. 3 years. He nodded thoughtfully. "You ever think about doing something else?" The question, though seemingly innocent, felt like a small wound. Camille forced herself to keep smiling. "I like it here," she said simply. The man shrugged. "Fair enough. Just seems like you could. I don't know. Aim higher." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Camille standing behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge. She wasn't sure what stung more, the implication that her work wasn't valuable or the unspoken assumption that she hadn't already aimed high. That this wasn't her survival and her pride wrapped into one. By mid-morning, the cafe was alive with its usual rhythm, though Camille couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her. It didn't help when a young woman entered, her blonde hair tied back in a sleek ponytail, and approached the counter with a clipboard in hand. "Hi," the woman said, her voice bright but distant. "I'm conducting a survey on customer experiences in local businesses. Do you have a moment to answer a few questions?" Camille hesitated. "I'm working right now, but..." "Oh, no problem," the woman interrupted, her tone casual but firm. "I can ask someone else." She turned to the nearest table, where an older white couple was sipping their coffee. Camille watched as the woman leaned in, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial tone. The couple glanced at Camille, their expressions unreadable, before nodding and beginning to speak. Though she couldn't hear the conversation, Camille felt its weight, the glances, the lowered voices, the way the woman scribbled notes quickly, her eyes flicking back to the counter as if Camille were an object of study rather than a person. It wasn't the first time she'd felt invisible in her own space. But it didn't make it any easier. The lunch rush brought its own set of challenges. A group of young professionals crowded the counter, their voices loud and overlapping as they placed their orders. Camille moved quickly, her hands steady despite the chaos. One man, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward, his expression impatient. "Can I get a turkey sandwich? And make it quick, I'm on a tight schedule." Camille nodded, ringing up his order. As she handed him his receipt, he frowned. "You overcharged me," he said, his voice sharp. "I don't think I did," Camille replied, her tone calm. "Well, check again," he insisted, his voice rising. "Because I'm not paying extra for your mistake." The line behind him grew restless, and Camille felt the pressure mounting. She double-checked the receipt, her hands trembling slightly. "It's correct," she said, her voice quieter now. The man scoffed, his tone dripping with condescension. "Figures," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can't even handle basic math." A few people in line exchanged glances, but no one spoke up. Camille felt the humiliation like a slap, but she refused to let it show. Later that afternoon, Camille's composure was tested again. A group of teenagers entered the cafe, their laughter loud and unrestrained. They ordered drinks and pastries, their energy filling the room. As Camille handed them their order, one of the boys smirked. "Thanks, sweetheart," he said, the words laced with mockery. Another boy laughed, nudging his friend. "Careful," he said, "she might spit in your coffee." The group erupted in laughter, and Camille's cheeks burned. She wanted to say something, to call them out, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned away, focusing on the next customer in line. By the time the cafe began to quiet down, Camille felt like she was running on fumes. The day had been a series of small, relentless battles, each one chipping away at her strength. As she wiped down the counter, Kevin approached, his expression concerned. "You okay?" he asked. Camille hesitated, then nodded. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. Kevin didn't press her, but his gaze lingered for a moment before he turned back to the kitchen. That evening, as Camille walked home, she thought about the day's events. None of the interactions had been overtly hostile. There had been no shouting, no slurs, no outright confrontations, and yet, the weight of it all was suffocating. It was the subtlety of it, the glances, the tones, the assumptions that cut the deepest. It was the way people found ways to remind her, without ever saying the words, that she didn't quite belong. But as Camille climbed the steps to her apartment, she felt a flicker of resolve. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. She knew, but she also knew she would face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her through today. Because she had to, and because she could. The next morning, Camille woke to the sound of rain tapping against her bedroom window. A soothing rhythm that belied the weight she felt pressing down on her chest. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment, summoning the strength to get out of bed. Each day seemed heavier than the last, as if the world had conspired to test her endurance. Yet she rose anyway, her resolve steady, if not unshaken. Sylvie's bake shop felt different that day, subdued, as though the rain outside had seeped into the walls. Camille's first customer was an older man in a tan raincoat, his glasses fogged from the humidity. He ordered a black coffee, his voice gruff but polite, and thanked her as he left. The simplicity of the interaction was a small relief, a reminder that not every moment had to feel like a battle. But relief was fleeting, and the first challenge of the day was already making its way through the door. It was a group of 3 women, their polished appearances and clipped accents signaling wealth and power. They walked in with an air of entitlement, barely glancing at Camille as they approached the counter. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm but measured. "What can I get for you?" The woman in the center, who wore an expensive scarf and carried a designer bag, looked at Camille for the first time. Her gaze was sharp, assessing, and something in it made Camille's stomach tighten. "We'll have 3 cappuccinos," the woman said, her tone brisk. "But could you make sure the milk is steamed properly? Last time, it wasn't quite right." Camille nodded, biting back the urge to respond. "Of course," she said, turning to the espresso machine. The women continued their conversation as though Camille wasn't there, their voices low but audible enough for her to catch fragments. "Hard to find good service these days," one of them said, her tone laced with exasperation. "Especially in these places," the other replied, her words trailing off but heavy with implication. Camille's hands tightened around the milk pitcher, her chest constricting with the familiar sting of being diminished without being addressed. She finished the drinks with practiced precision, placing them on the counter with a polite smile. "Here you go," she said, stepping back as the women took their drinks without so much as a glance in her direction. The rain had picked up by mid-morning, and with it came a surge of customers seeking shelter. Among them was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a dark trench coat. He placed his order, a latte and a scone, then lingered at the counter, his eyes fixed on Camille. "You know," he began, his voice casual but probing, "I've been coming here for years. Don't think I've seen you before." Camille offered a polite smile. "I've been here for a while. Maybe we just missed each other." He chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe, or maybe I just didn't notice you." The comment hung in the air, heavy with implications Camille didn't dare acknowledge. Instead, she handed him his order with steady hands, her voice calm. "Enjoy your coffee." As he walked away, she felt his gaze linger for just a moment too long, a subtle reminder of the power dynamics that existed even in seemingly innocuous exchanges. The lunch rush brought a fresh wave of challenges. A middle-aged woman entered with a teenage boy, their conversation animated as they approached the counter. The boy, wearing a school uniform, looked at Camille with open curiosity. "I'll take a turkey sandwich," the woman said, her tone brisk, "and a lemonade for my son." Camille rang up the order, her movements quick and efficient. As she handed over the receipt, the boy leaned forward. "Do you work here every day?" he asked, his voice bright. "Most days," Camille replied, smiling despite herself. The boy turned to his mother. "See? I told you. She's always here." The woman stiffened, her expression unreadable. She glanced at Camille, her gaze fleeting but loaded with something Camille couldn't quite place: pity, perhaps, or judgment. "Come on, Nathan," the woman said, steering her son toward a table. "Let's not bother her." Camille watched them go, her chest tightening. The boy's curiosity had been innocent, even kind. But his mother's reaction turned it into something else, a reminder that Camille's presence in this space was, to some, an anomaly that needed explaining. The afternoon brought another confrontation. This one more direct. A man in his 30s approached the counter. His expression stern. "I was here yesterday," he began, "and I think I was overcharged." Camille frowned, her mind racing to recall the transaction. "I'm sorry about that. Do you have the receipt?" "I don't," he said, his tone sharp. "But I know I shouldn't have paid that much. I can check the register records," Camille offered, keeping her voice steady. The man scoffed. "That won't be necessary. Just refund me." Camille hesitated, glancing at the growing line behind him. "I can't process a refund without a receipt." "But, you can't, or you won't," the man interrupted, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. I shouldn't have to fight to get my money back." The cafe fell silent, all eyes on the counter. Camille felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck, but she refused to falter. "Sir," she said calmly, "if you'd like, I can call the manager to assist you." The man glared at her for a long moment before throwing up his hands. "Forget it," he muttered, storming out the door. The tension lingered even after he was gone, the weight of the interaction settling heavily on Camille's shoulders. By the end of the day, Camille felt like she had been stretched thin, her patience and composure tested at every turn. As she closed up the cafe, Kevin approached, his expression concerned. "You okay?" he asked. Camille nodded, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. "Just another day," Kevin sighed. "It shouldn't have to be like this." "No," Camille agreed quietly. "It shouldn't." As she stepped outside into the rain-soaked evening, Camille felt the weariness settle deeper into her bones. The day had been relentless, each moment a reminder of the unspoken hierarchies that governed her world. But even as the weight threatened to overwhelm her, she found a small spark of resolve. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but she would face them, as she always did, with quiet strength and unwavering dignity. For in a world that sought to diminish her, Camille had learned the power of persistence, of holding her ground even when the ground itself seemed to shift beneath her feet. The next morning, the air was thick with humidity, a warning of the storm forecasted to arrive by afternoon. Camille arrived at Sylvie's bake shop with a quiet determination, her routine as familiar and steady as the sunrise. Yet she felt it deep in her bones that the day would demand more from her than usual. It wasn't intuition. Exactly. It was experience. The accumulation of years spent navigating a world that often asked her to bear its silent burdens. The first test came early. A young woman entered the cafe, her sleek ponytail damp from the morning mist. She carried a tablet under her arm and approached the counter with the air of someone used to getting what she wanted. "Good morning," Camille said, her voice steady. "What can I get for you?" The woman didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked Camille up and down, her expression carefully neutral. Finally, she ordered a chai latte. Her tone clipped. Camille moved quickly, her hands steady as she prepared the drink. But when she handed it over, the woman frowned. "This isn't hot enough," she said, her voice loud enough to draw attention. Camille blinked, her professionalism intact. "I can remake it for you." "You shouldn't have to," the woman replied sharply. "It's your job to get it right the first time." The words stung, but Camille refused to let it show. She nodded and turned back to the espresso machine, the murmurs of other customers pricking at her ears. By the time she handed the woman the new drink, her hands trembled slightly, but her smile remained. "Here you go," she said. "I hope this one's better." The woman didn't reply. She took the drink and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor. The morning rush brought its own challenges. A group of older men occupied a table near the window, their conversation loud and animated. Camille recognized one of them, Mr. Hartwell, a regular who always ordered black coffee and left a generous tip. Today, however, his demeanor was different. As Camille brought their drinks to the table, she caught snippets of their conversation. "Can you believe it?" one of the men said, shaking his head. "They're everywhere these days." Mr. Hartwell chuckled, though his laughter held no humor. "It's not like it used to be. Back then, people knew their place." The words hit Camille like a slap. She froze for a moment, the tray of drinks balanced in her hands. Before forcing herself to move, she placed the cups on the table, her movements precise, and walked away without a word. Behind the counter, she tried to shake off the sting of the comment, but it clung to her like a shadow. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the ease with which they had been spoken. The casualness of the dismissal. To them, she wasn't Camille, the woman who greeted them every morning with a smile. She was a symbol, a target, a reminder of a world they wanted to keep at bay. By midday, the cafe was packed. Camille worked tirelessly, her movements efficient but unhurried. She was in the middle of ringing up an order when she heard a commotion near the door. A man in his 40s stood just inside the entrance, his voice loud and accusatory. "Who owns this place?" he demanded. Kevin emerged from the kitchen, his expression calm but wary. "I'm the owner," he said. "What's the problem?" The man pointed toward the counter, his face red with anger. "I just parked my car, and one of your employees scratched it." Kevin frowned. "I'm sorry to hear that, but none of my employees have left the building today." The man's eyes narrowed. "Are you calling me a liar?" "No," Kevin replied evenly, "but I'm saying it couldn't have been one of us." The man turned his gaze to Camille, his accusation sharp as a blade. "She looks like she'd do it." Camille's heart raced, her composure slipping for the first time that day. "I've been here all morning," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I haven't left the counter." The man sneered. "Convenient. Just like people like you always playing the victim." The cafe fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Before Camille could respond, Kevin stepped forward, his voice firm. "That's enough," he said. "You can either leave, or I'll call the police." The man hesitated, his bravado faltering under the collective glare of the other customers. Finally, he turned and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Camille exhaled shakily, her hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. Kevin placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. "You okay?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. As the day wore on, the challenges continued to mount. A woman refused to tip, muttering something about poor service. A teenager laughed openly at her name tag, mimicking her introduction in a mocking tone. Each interaction chipped away at her, the accumulation of slights forming an invisible wound. By the time the cafe closed, Camille felt like she could barely stand. As she cleaned the counter, Kevin approached, his expression troubled. "You handled yourself well today," he said. Camille didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but resolute. "Why does it always have to be this hard?" Kevin sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know you make this place better. Don't let them take that away from you." Camille nodded, though the weight of the day still lingered. As she stepped outside into the humid evening, she felt a flicker of resolve. The storm was coming, but she had weathered worse. And she would weather this too. The storm arrived overnight, a fierce wind battering the windows of Camille's small apartment. The rain came down in relentless sheets, mirroring the unrest that had been building inside her for days. When morning came, the sky was still heavy with dark clouds, and the streets shimmered with puddles reflecting the gray light. Camille stared at her reflection in the mirror as she tied her hair back. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed the weariness she could no longer hide. She told herself it was just another day, but deep down, she felt something shifting, a taut wire stretched too far, ready to snap. The cafe was unusually quiet when she arrived, the storm having kept many customers at home. For the first hour, the stillness felt like a reprieve, a chance to breathe. But then, like clockwork, the first test arrived. A man in a rain-soaked trench coat pushed through the door, shaking water onto the floor as he entered. He was tall, with a gruff demeanor, and his impatience was palpable. "Coffee," he barked. "Black, and hurry it up." Camille moved swiftly, her hands steady despite the tension radiating from him. She placed the cup on the counter, her smile polite but distant. The man frowned, lifting the cup to his nose. "This smells burnt," he said, his voice loud enough to carry through the quiet cafe. "I can make you another," Camille offered, her tone measured. "You should have made it right the first time," he snapped, slamming the cup down. The sound echoed in the room, and Camille felt the eyes of the other customers on her. She remade the coffee without a word, handing it to him with the same quiet professionalism she had mastered over the years. The man grunted in acknowledgement before stalking to a table, leaving her standing at the counter with her heart pounding. An hour later, the cafe had begun to fill, the storm outside driving people indoors. Among the new arrivals was a woman in her 60s, her gray hair tucked neatly under a wide-brimmed hat. She approached the counter with a deliberate grace, her eyes scanning the menu before landing on Camille. "Good morning," Camille said, her voice warm. "What can I get for you?" The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering over Camille's face before she spoke. "I'll take a latte," she said, her tone clipped, "but make sure the cup is clean. I'm particular about that." "Of course," Camille replied, ignoring the sting of the remark. As she prepared the drink, she overheard the woman speaking to the customer next to her. "You know," the woman said, her voice low but audible, "standards really have gone down in places like this. They hire anyone these days." Camille felt the words like a slap, her hands faltering for just a moment before she regained her composure. She placed the latte on the counter, her expression calm. "Here you go," she said. The woman didn't respond. She took the cup and walked away, her back stiff with self-righteousness. The lunch rush brought a fresh wave of challenges, each one more exhausting than the last. A man accused Camille of short-changing him, his voice loud and accusatory. A young woman returned her sandwich, claiming it was thrown together. Each interaction chipped away at Camille's resolve, the quiet hostility wearing her down like a relentless tide. But it was the final encounter of the day that pushed her to the edge. A young couple entered the cafe, their voices bright with laughter as they approached the counter. The man placed an order for 2 lattes, his tone friendly, but as Camille prepared the drinks, the woman leaned in close to him, whispering something that made him chuckle. Camille didn't catch the words, but she didn't need to. The way they glanced at her, the smirks on their faces, told her everything she needed to know. When she handed them their drinks, the woman spoke, her voice dripping with mockery. "Thanks, sweetheart. You're doing great, for someone in your position." The words hit Camille like a punch. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, her composure cracking under the weight of the day. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice sharper than she intended. The woman raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Oh, nothing. Just saying you're doing your best." The man laughed, and Camille felt something inside her snap. "I don't need your condescension," she said, her voice firm now. "If you have a problem with the way I do my job, you can take it up with the manager." The cafe fell silent, all eyes on the counter. The couple stared at Camille, their smug expressions faltering. "Wow," the woman said, her tone icy. "No need to get defensive. We were just trying to be nice." "Nice?" Camille repeated, her voice shaking with restrained emotion. "What you said wasn't nice. It was disrespectful, and I won't stand here and let you talk down to me like that." The man opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of Kevin's voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, stepping out from the kitchen. Camille turned to him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "No," she said quietly. "No problem." The couple grabbed their drinks and left without another word, the door slamming shut behind them. As the cafe emptied, Kevin approached Camille, his expression soft with concern. "You okay?" he asked. Camille nodded, though her hands trembled. "I'm fine." Kevin hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to put up with this," he said. Camille looked at him, her voice quiet but resolute. "Yes, I do, because if I don't, who will?" That evening, as Camille walked home in the rain, she felt the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. The challenges she had faced weren't new, but they felt sharper, more cutting. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was a spark of something else, something stronger. Camille knew the world wouldn't change overnight. The prejudices she faced were deeply rooted, woven into the fabric of everyday life. But she also knew that by standing her ground, by refusing to shrink in the face of hostility, she was planting seeds of change. And as she stepped through her apartment door, drenched but unbroken, she allowed herself a small, weary smile. The fight wasn't over, but neither was she. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.